Thank you so much for that warm introduction to Professor Jean-Charles and to this conversation. It's my delight and pleasure to talk to my colleague, Professor Jean-Charles, about Martin Luther King, but as importantly about her book that seeks to raise some critical questions about the way we celebrate this holiday and about Dr. King's meaning for the movements of today, 2021. It's really, as I say, just a delight and pleasure to be here with Dr. Jean-Charles in this book, which is Martin Luther King and the Trumpet of Conscience Today. I urge it for everyone out there. It's a really nice read. It's a beautifully written book, and it's not a long read. So I urge the book on all who anyone who hasn't yet gotten it, please do so. Régine, if I may, you begin your work on Dr. King focusing on these lectures that he gave towards the end of his life, after he had two very tumultuous years in which his views really begin to shift. He begins to look at racism in the North, in Chicago, the Poor People's Campaign, the war. He begins to be much more outspoken about US militarism, and in particular about the imperialist intentions of the United States in Vietnam. And you do deal with all of that, as well as his failures to address forms of oppression that seem so prescient and pertinent to us today. But I want to start here, Régine. You start by saying that we approach MLK Day in a manner that is both wary and wary, I would say, is the word that you use to describe the way we think about MLK and the way it is commemorated in the United States, wary and weary. Say a bit more about that. This is, many of us welcome this holiday, look forward to it as an opportunity for reflection and learning, but it also comes with a cost. Can you say more about that, Régine?
Absolutely. First, thank you so much, Margaret. This is such a treat for me. It's a joy to be able to be in conversation with you. I think you already know how much I admire you and respect you and all that you've done just in your life and in your career on behalf of the movement, the Black Freedom Movement, and just advancing justice in our world. So thank you for just being a wonderful colleague and for welcoming me to Northeastern as well. And for reading my book. Also, I appreciate that, though it makes me a little nervous. So yes, you know, I in the beginning, I refer to this as taking King out of the box, right? And so I think what happens is every year in January, we get invitations to speak, right? And we kind of gear up for these celebrations, and often the celebrations have the same exact theme. Often they reference the dream, often they reference a colorblind vision, but they do so in a way that for me always felt very surface without delving deeper into the more complicated parts of King's vision. And I think, you know, I think about this really as a literary scholar and a cultural critic. One of the things that really bothers me is when something is a symbol and it's emptied of its meaning, right? And so for me, I just noticed that some of the celebrations that I was seeing, even in my own community, even on the campuses that I've been on, have just started to feel almost trite. And, you know, part of what I want us to think about is, you know, what does it mean to not only think about this day in January, but what does it mean to think about it all year long, right? What does it mean to think about it and have it inform our vision of justice and not just have it be a kind of one-off?
So that makes a lot of sense, that that essentially the messages and the life of Dr. King, the complexities of Dr. King, the issues that drove him are those that should concern us 365, not just one day of the year. Certainly that makes sense, but you're saying something beyond that. You're also saying that we need to take Dr. King out of the box, that MLK Day becomes in effect, a sort of shorthand that short shrifts the complexity of his life, his philosophy, his thinking, his ideology, his actions in ways that do not serve us well. Don't serve us well from the perspective of history in terms of the kinds of memory that we want to hold on to with respect to what Dr. King did and gave to the country and to the world, but also don't serve us well in terms of understanding his relationship to today's movements. Absolutely. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely, yes. I think, Margaret, I also, for me, it became especially needling when I became a parent. And I was at my children's schools and I would see how, and the messages they were getting about Martin Luther King. And I would always have to be like, no, 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 that's not the, no, there's more, And so I do think that there's a way in which this education that we're giving to our children, that we're giving to the next generation is incomplete in many ways. We know when it comes to the history of racism in the United States, when it comes to so much of the past in this country, the history that they're getting is truly incomplete, right? And so when I began, when you say that there's more to what I'm saying, I think you're right, because there's other layer was added as I began to think about the next generation coming up. And are they simply going to learn just like me? Are they going to have to all memorize that I have a dream speech and that's it, right? And so the fact that my 8-year-old, is learning about King the same way that I learned about King was really disturbing to me. And it was disturbing to me as someone who appreciates history and understands the importance of history, as a scholar of Black studies also, but also as someone who is committed to social justice and who is so aware and attuned to what these movements are today and what they're doing, right? That is in some ways quite different, but I think is also an expansion and a corrective of what King was doing as well, right? So I think that my children they don't see this through line from the Black freedom. They don't think about the Black freedom movement, right? They think civil rights, okay, and then now we have Black Lives Matter. And I'm like, no, 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 there's a through line. And I think that's what's missing also in our schools and educating our children.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense, that we talk about Dr. King in the context of a through line from the movements of the 1960s and 1950s, in which he was so much of a part, and today's movements, BLM and other movements of today. But it's also true that movements of today just try to distinguish themselves quite sharply from some of the sort of the anchors of the movements of the 1960s. And in particular, I'm thinking about the way in which in your book you address Dr. King's patriarchal perspectives, that he did not embrace anti-sexism. He certainly did not embrace, gay LGBT communities as very much part of the beloved community, and so the movements of today have essentially made a quite sharp break with that piece of the tradition of Dr. King. And I guess my question here is, this is one man. We're laying a lot on him. He was only one of many individuals, of that movement. He was in community with leadership, yes, but very much in community with many other people during this period of time. But so are we looking at his flaws? Are we looking at the flaws of a movement, and how what kinds of correctives can we make today while still honoring the reputation, we're still honoring the contributions that he made?
That's so important. That's so important, Margaret. Thank you. Just as you were saying that, the word that really came to me was thinking about building, right? So if we think about it as absolutely he was a flawed man, absolutely the movement was flawed. We all have our flaws and all movements have their flaws, right? But this kind of, I think about it not as just a break, but maybe a corrective, right? And so this is the joy, or this is the privilege that you have of being a student of history and coming in a later generation is you can look and see, okay, well, what was done wrong here? And I think this is where the BLM activists have done a really great job is, they say we're not doing that one leader thing anymore. We're not doing that. We're not using that model or that framework in which there's one identifiable leader that has to be the voice of the movement. They're very intentional and explicit and Black feminist in their decisions, in how they talk about the leadership, right? They say it's a collective, that it's a community. And so I actually see many of these movements today as being a truer manifestation of the beloved community, right? Because in this beloved community that we have in the 21st century, everyone is invited to the table, right? The activists who are queer, who are lesbian, who are gay, who are bisexual, who are transgender, they're all invited to the table. So for me, it's not so much a doing away with some of these ideas like the beloved community, but rather it's how can we get this right? How can we do it better in this generation?
So that makes a lot of sense. That you also address in your book Dr. King's radicalism, which is sometimes disappears in more sort of in the kinds of celebrations and commemorations that take place, for example, as you say, in your children's school, when children are encouraged to participate in service activities, to help their neighbor, for example. Of course, we want to help our neighbors, but Dr. King's radicalism was extended far beyond the kind of the kind of the good human being that we all want to be, and that sometimes gets lost in our celebrations of this day. And so, could you say a little bit about that? Can you say a little bit about what we can do to recover the radical spirit, the radical ideology, really, not just spirit, but the radical ideology, the radical thinking of Dr. King?
Oh, I love that. I love that so much, Margaret. So I'll say two things. So I think that first, I'm not the first one to make this argument, right, about the radical king and we need to recuperate the radical king. In fact, I even saw a talk that you gave at MIT in 1992, and it was a Martin Luther King lecture. And you were talking about how the onus is on your generation and people like you who were there with him to choose how he's remembered also, right? That you all have to have a say in how he's remembered, which I loved so much. You said, I think it is still our movement and it is we who must define it, right? And so I think that that's an important part of it. I think by, kind of sitting also with the elders, right? Sitting with the experts, sitting with the people who understand that and learning from them. That's number one. But I also think, about something like his stance on the military, right? And his very strong stance against militarism and his very strong stance against war. So what would it look like in our schools to talk to our children about, to do an MLK service activity around maybe supporting refugees who are fleeing war, as opposed to, just giving kind of donations to the food pantry, right? And so that way you're actually connecting it to something that was a radical stance of his, especially at the time, and that is still really problematic, right? And I think that extends to mass incarceration, that extends to the prison industrial complex, right? Because we all know that militarism is a part of that. So I would say that digging deeper would certainly be a way to do that, and making connections that are not comfortable, right? It might not be comfortable for us to talk about, the, how he describes them, the horrors of militarism, or how that militarism is manifesting itself today, whether it's in the prison industrial complex, whether it's in the policing, rampant policing. So that might not be comfortable for people, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge.
And what do you find in his in these speeches that he gave in Canada, the Trumpet of Conscience speeches, many of which were the majority of which were in Canada and Toronto? What do you find in there that leads you to suggest that King might have been a critic of the mass incarceration, and might have been perhaps a proponent of some forms of abolition as far as our criminal legal system is concerned? What do you find in there that leads you to that view?
Yes, so I think certainly in nonviolence and social change, and also in oh goodness, I can't remember the name of this one. But so basically his views on the military really is what it is for me at the core of it. Because you know that I think that if we think about mass incarceration today and the spending for the military today, right, we know that there are a lot of kind of connections between the two, right, in terms of the militarization of prisons. And so for me, that's a big connection right there. I also think the way that he says things like, you know, everything is interrelated, he says over and over again. And I think that the abolitionist view is actually exactly that view, that everything is interrelated, right? That we can't, that when we talk about abolition, we're also talking about creating better environments in our neighborhoods, creating better schools. We're talking about creating a better healthcare system. All of those things are interrelated. So it's a very integrated point of view that I think really resonates with what King is saying in these lectures.
So that makes a lot of sense when we talk about the prison industrial complex, and you certainly make the links between militarism and the exponential growth of the prison industrial complex and the movements that address that today. Perhaps it might be more challenging as you look at another chapter of your book, which focuses on sexual violence, and here, of course, we know that King's reputation on these questions doesn't really give us a lot of, sort of a lot of support to conclude that he would come out on the right side of these issues. First of all, we're looking at a time when women were excluded from, having the voices of influence in the movement, including, brilliant women who worked really closely with Dr. King from the very inception of his career, like Ella Baker, all of the women who were on the stage at the August 28th, 1963 March on Washington. I was there. I saw those women on the stage. None of them got to speak, or if they spoke for 1 minute. And of course, Dr. King's very troublesome personal history around gender. So those are just realities. Those are facts, but you make really strong arguments that Dr. King has to be considered as well in the context of our fight against sexual violence. Say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that chapter was very challenging for me because it was something I was very committed to writing about. A lot of my own academic work and my activist work has been in the movement to end violence against women and girls, the movement to end gender-based violence. And it was really important to me to kind of think through what the lens of the trumpet of conscience can help us to see. And what I found when I was writing this chapter is almost like my lens reversed, right? And I started to think to myself, oh, wow, how much more powerful these essays become when we take the tools of intersectionality, when we take the perspective of what was Fannie Lou Hamer doing at this time? What was Ella Baker doing at this time? When we take the perspective of who is actually being excluded, and that for me kind of made it a much more rich reading. And so I felt like what I was doing almost in that chapter was aspirational, in the sense that I could say, well, here we see that the Black Lives Matter movement, that the Me Too movement are robustly intersectional, right? They're extremely intersectional. They're extremely committed to the idea of a coalition. How beautiful would that have been if that lens had been applied during this time, right? So it was almost like a reverse that I had to do. And then I spent a lot of time focusing on the women, right? Those women up on the stage that, couldn't speak. I spent a lot of time thinking about Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and reading, about what they were doing. I mean, I love, Ella Baker says, strong people don't need strong leaders, right? Which was actually exactly the same. This is the same ethic that we see at work in the Me Too movement, because even Tarana Burke will say that Me Too is just not about her, right? And in the Black Lives Matter movement as well, and in the prison abolition movement too.
That's great. Régine, as well, you address not only mass incarceration, you address gender-based violence, but you also suggest that Dr. King, in these last essays, in this group of essays, they certainly weren't his last, but they were late in his development as later in his development as a thinker and as an actor and as a leader. And not only is his voice growing stronger and more prominent, stronger and more influential on the question of war and militarism, but he's also talking about capitalism and in these talks, and he's talking about the ways in which Black communities, African American communities are, seem to be mired in a kind of poverty that is clearly race related, but is also associated with the economic system in which we're all living. What would you say about his own thinking, the way his thinking evolved over time on these issues?
I think, Margaret, that's one of the things that makes me most sad as I reflect on Dr. King, because I think that I wonder, he was on the cusp of these kind of discoveries, right? So he's thinking about capitalism. He's having a deepened class analysis, right? He's maybe he would have eventually arrived at the gender analysis, right? We don't know, because the life was cut short. And so, but what I really see in these, and I even love the idea, I mean, originally it was called King's Call to Conscience, but what I also love about the Trumpet of Conscience as a title is that this idea of the trumpet, right? So like sounding the trumpet, and it makes me think about trajectories, and it makes me think about where else he would have gone, because I do think that there's the thinking is being refined. And I think, again, that this is so helpful for our students, right? And for activists today to remember that your thinking can evolve, right? Your thinking can evolve on some of these things.
Yes.
And I think that that's really important for this generation also to remember.
Yeah. And I also was taken by your reference to Bernice King, Dr. King's daughter's comment, as well as that of Joyce Ladner, that he embraced what John Lewis called good trouble. That we think about Dr. King is celebrated as a man of peace, and of course he was. A man of agape, of course he was. A man of love, of course he was. But he also understood, as I think I think it was either Joyce or perhaps his daughter, who said that he understood that uprisings were the voice of the suppressed, the voice of the subordinated, and that inevitably fighting for justice would involve uprisings that might not entirely be peaceful. So how do we reconcile this? Our embrace of Dr. King as peace loving, and his understanding that some forms of aggressive action are necessary in order to confront injustice.
Margaret, I think that this is, again, one of those ones that just needles me so much, right? Because I think that in our rush to kind of embrace thinking about him as only this person of nonviolence, that we do a disservice, right, to the fuller and more complete picture. And in the chapter on, I think it may have been a Christmas sermon on peace, but he talks about some of this. Oh, no. This is the one on nonviolence, right? Nonviolence and social change. And he digs into this a little bit, and you can see his frustration with this, not even frustration, but his anger, right? At the ways in which this injustice is stripping people of their dignity, right? And he talks about that comparison between property and human beings. And I think for him at the end of the day, it was a human question, right? And he also, I could say this for me as a believer too, Jesus modeled anger for us, right? We know this. And so I don't think that he would have never embraced these emotions. And I think so I appreciated Bernice King's intervention on that, because it is true. And it reminded me also very much of Baldwin, which is another thing that I enjoyed about just that, talking about the riot and the unheard, right? I feel I don't even remember your question anymore. But
you've addressed it, which is to say that the full complexity, the full complexity, which suggests what a large figure we're dealing with. That his thinking, that it was not this or that, but it was this and that. Right. that it
That's
was
exactly right.
in that nonviolence was important, not just for the ways in which we relate to one another as common occupants of the planet, but also that sometimes nonviolence had to be put aside in order for claims to be heard. And so that we're talking with a way of living, but also a strategy, a way of living,
That's
and a way
right.
of acting, but oftentimes a way of acting that had to yield if voices were truly to be heard. And of course, Bernice also said, we see him as a man of love, and we assume that everyone loved him, but actually, as Bernice says, he was assassinated. He was not, uniformly, universally loved
That's right.
during his time in leadership. He was
Mhm,
assassinated. He was followed by the FBI, hounded by our
mhm,
own
mhm,
FBI.
mhm, mhm.
His phones tapped, his hotel rooms and his cars tapped, and his life
That's
under
right.
threat, as he
That's right.
himself
That's right.
indicated. He felt the threat
That's right.
when he spoke
That that reminds me,
when he
Margaret, too.
spoke in Memphis.
Oh,
Yes, I'm
sorry.
sorry. Go ahead.
That reminds me too of, the poem that I discussed in the first chapter, right? When Carl Wendelheim says, now that he is safely dead, let us praise him, right? Build monuments to his glory now that he's safely dead. And he wrote that a few years after King was assassinated. Yeah.
Yeah. No, you pull together a really quite remarkable and deeply informative collection of voices about King, not only those who knew him and worked with him, and the voices of his children and people like Joyce Joyce Ladner, but as well the voices of artists who have thought about him, Nikki Giovanni, and yes, it's a wonderful set of reflections on Dr. King, and suggest that for many years to come, we will be thinking about him and what he left us, enjoying and unpacking the complexity of
Yeah.
his life. I guess my last question for you, Régine, would be that now that those of us who were in his generation, and I do count myself among them, those who say, I marched with Martin, now that our time is moving on, what are you looking forward 25 years down the line? Um, how will we be commemorating this day?
Mm.
And what does it mean for us to have one Martin Luther King Day as opposed to a King Day, a John Lewis Day, a
Yes.
Paul Robeson
Yes.
Day, a
Oh,
W.E.B. Du Bois Day, and
yes.
Ella Baker Day, a Rosa
Yes.
Parks Day?
That's it. I think you answered your own question. But that would be wonderful. I think if 25 years from now down the road, we'd evolve to be truly appreciative of all of those people that may, and even the ones whose names we don't know, right? How do I think about that a lot? How do we honor those whose names would never have become known or never have become known, right? That's really what I think is the vision, is what I would hope for in the generations to come. And that people would have that both and thinking, right? That just like you said, it's not this or that, it's this and that, right? And so yes, we can honor King, and we can honor the nameless people that contributed to this movement. And we can understand that there was a groundswell of grassroots organizers, many of whom we will never know, right, who contributed to this movement. And then, Margaret, I was thinking about this question, and I think, John Lewis, I think one of the greatest gifts that he gave us was, you remember he had that letter that he wrote that he asked to only be published after he died, right? And if you don't mind, I'm just going to read quickly from it. But he says, while my time has now come to an end, I want you to know, and he's talking to young activists, right? He's talking actually to BLM activists. I want you to know that in the last days and hours of my life, you inspired me. You filled me with hope about the next chapter of the great American story when you used your power to make a difference in society. Millions of people motivated simply by human compassion laid down the burdens of division. Around the country and the world, you set aside race, class, age, language, and nationality to demand respect for human dignity, end quote. And what I love about that is that's the gift of one generation to another, right? Is that here's this man that, like you know, was there, was marched on Washington, was there beside King, and but sees something that is happening now in this generation and basically wants to bless them, right? And encourage them to continue on. And I just think that's so beautiful and necessary for us all.
Thank you so much for your work, Régine. Thank you for the book. Thank you for the thinking that you've expressed here today about our current movements. Thank you for your participation in those current movements and your leadership. And thank you as well for teaching our students here at Northeastern about Dr. King, the movements he led, and the movements for the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Margaret. This has been a joy.